Hi guys, welcome to the channel. As always, make yourself nice and cozy and let's get into these Reddit stories I gathered for you.
Stay away from the park.
Submitted by this statistician 473. Last week, I agreed to meet up with my friend at midnight. It was a spontaneous decision, sparked by the late night conversation about how he hadn't done something adventurous in a while. We had just reunited after finishing high school. Having gone to different ones, we decided to go to the park, a familiar place where we used to hang out and catch up. We arrived at the park around midnight, the air cool and still. Usually a large map at the entrance detailed the trails and paths, but tonight it was missing. The park was unusually dark, with the lights that typically illuminated the pathways completely off. It struck us as eerie and unsettling, but we shrugged off the discomfort and decided to explore further. We walked down the main path, the gravel crunching under our feet in the darkness. The deeper we went into the park, the more unsettling it became. That's when we started noticing them. Clothes scattered everywhere. There was a grey long-sleeved shirt slumped over the barrier on the side of the gravel path. A pair of jeans was draped over a bush, and a red jacket hung eerily from a tree bench. There was no rhyme or reason to it. It was like someone had emptied out an entire wardrobe into the park. We kept walking, our pace a little slower now, eyes darting around to take in our surroundings. As we ventured further, we kept finding more clothes. There was a pair of jeans draped over a low-hanging branch, a colorful scarf twisted around the bush, and even a lone sneaker lying in the middle of the path. The further we went, the more it seemed like the park had turned into an eerie, open-air closet. Each step felt heavier, the air colder, as if we were walking into the unknown. We decided to push forward, even as the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach grew. George and I continued along the path, the night air growing colder with each step. It wasn't long before we spotted more clothes, shirts, pants, even a pair of sneakers, scattered haphazardly around. Just as I was about to suggest turning back, I caught a glimpse of something in the marshy water off to the side. For a split second, a figure stood there, partially illuminated by the dim moonlight. It had a humanoid shape, but something was off about it. Its proportions were strange, giving it an uncanny valley effect. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. George, noticing my reaction, whispered urgently, "Did you see that?" George and I agreed that turning back was the best choice if we wanted to stay alive. We retraced our steps toward the park entrance, but George suddenly froze. "Hey, my phone's missing," he said, his voice tense as he checked his pockets. I frowned, glancing around. Man, we literally covered half the park. The only way back is either around the trail or through the pond, and honestly, I don't think you want to go through the pond, considering we just saw that thing in the marsh. We tried to push on, but the trail seemed to stretch endlessly before us. The darkness around us grew deeper, and despite our best efforts, the familiar landmarks that had guided us before were nowhere to be seen. "What the fuck, dude? This park isn't a full block big, and I don't see the entrance," I muttered, a chill creeping up my spine. Despite our growing unease, George and I decided to keep moving forward. Sitting ducks in the middle of the park didn't seem like a good idea. We continued along the trail, the path seemingly endless. My heart pounded in my chest and every rustle of leaves made me jump. Then I started to notice something strange. I could hear footsteps behind us, almost in sync with our own, but slightly off. It was subtle, but enough to set my nerves on edge. I turned slightly towards George, mouthing, "Stop walking. We're being followed." We came to a halt, and in that moment, I felt something bump into me. It wasn't like bumping into a person. It felt more like colliding with a stack of sticks or a frail, thin wall. It was as if I had run into something insubstantial yet unsettling. I screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. George's eyes were wide with fear, matching my own. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining our ears for any sound, but there was nothing. After a while of more walking, the footsteps seemed to disappear. The fear that had gripped me started to lessen, but a chill ran through me. I reached to zip up my hoodie, only to realize it was gone. My heart skipped a beat. How could it have just disappeared? Panic started to set in again, and we quickened our pace. As we turned the corner, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the middle of the trail, was a scarecrow-like figure, wearing my hoodie. It stood eerily still, its form barely visible in the dim light. My blood ran cold, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Panicked, I grabbed George's arm and pulled him to sprint in the opposite direction, deeper into the park. We tore through the darkness, our breaths coming in raged gasps. The fear drove us faster, but the park seemed endless, the trees and shadows blending into one another, making it hard to tell if we were actually moving anywhere. After what felt like an eternity of running, we finally stopped to catch our breath. The fear of being followed had subsided slightly, but we were still completely disoriented. I looked around at the unfamiliar surroundings, realizing we had no idea where we were. "We need to mark our path," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've already seen how the clothes are scattered everywhere. Let's use our clothes to mark where we've been." George nodded, still catching his breath, and we began to strategically place our clothing items along the trail. I tore my tank top in two, draping one piece over a nearby fence and the other over a low branch. George threw his shirt onto a nearby tree branch. We kept moving, leaving behind the trail of our belongings to track our way back. We stumbled through the darkness until we finally spotted a tall fence with barbed wire at the top. It was our only hope. "George, we need to get over this," I shouted, panting heavily. George boosted me up and I grasped at the top of the fence, preparing to climb over. I was just about to swing my leg over when I saw George jump to grab my hand. As he reached up, his foot got snagged by something. A branch twisted in the shape of a hand. It yanked him down with a powerful force. I heard his scream, frantic and filled with terror, as he was dragged into the bushes and swallowed by the darkness. I dropped to the ground on the other side of the fence, my heart racing and my hands shaking. I ran, desperate for help, ignoring the pain of my cuts and bruises. When I returned with a group of people, the park was eerily normal. The clothes were gone, the scarecrow was nowhere to be seen, and George had vanished without a trace. The park was calm and serene as it had always been. The police, skeptical and concerned, treated me as a delusional madman. I was arrested and charged with George's disappearance and presumed murder. They dismissed my franking pleas and the story of what had happened. As I sit here in my cell, I find myself scribbling this letter. It's all so surreal. My sense of reality has fractured, and I'm left with nothing but this story. I'm a patient in a psychiatric ward, and perhaps this is my last attempt to make sense of the nightmare that has become my life.
What is terror?
Submitted by Nuclear End Creator. What is terror? Terror is what I felt that night staring at that thing. The feeling of knowing what happened to my friends, knowing I barely survived, knowing it exists. It wasn't a special night, just an average Wednesday, a good flow of people in and out of the little shop I worked in on Sarsaparilla Avenue. We sold an average amount of stuff. I work as meat clerk, cutting and stocking meats. Miss Weatherby came by, asked for something unusual for her. Being a regular, anything she could have ordered would be rather unusual. She ordered a 6-bone rib roast at 8:16 a.m. She usually came in at 3:14 every Thursday for 7 pounds of ground beef. She cooks about a pound a night with various things. Just always liked ground beef as her protein. People were friendly. Co-workers and I got along really well. Then again, we always did, like a little family. James, a co-worker, used to work there. He comes up to me around lunch time and invites me to his house after work. It was his birthday. I agree. I tell him I might be a little late since I had to close up. He worked hours where that wasn't a thing for him, and I was gonna stop at a liquor store on there to grab something special to celebrate. He was a great dude, really was, so I wanted him to feel special on the day that really wasn't at all special, other than it was his birthday. I work, time flies, and finally we close. Goes smooth as butter as usual. I grab my stuff and stop at the liquor store on the way to his house. I grabbed a bottle of Johnny Walker Red Label and RC Cola. Only cola that mellows the alcohol of whiskey but doesn't add or take away from the normal flavor if you mix it right. I got to his house and all the lights were off. I found that strange and walked up to the house and knocked. No answer, so I did it again. No answer. I felt strange and I don't know why. I tested the doorknob. It was unlocked. I didn't think much of it. Been to the guy's house plenty of times and I wanted to give him his present and his peace, so I walked to the kitchen with my phone light on. The living room connected to the kitchen, allowing for all these parties and fun. I remember walking into the kitchen and seeing hanging from the bar area that happy birthday hanging there in the dark. Felt even more strange, but waved it off as he was really tired. Thing about feeling strange and being in strange situations, you find yourself trying to put ration to it. So I find myself looking at my phone's time, 7:18. Wasn't really even that late, and the sign was still just hanging. So here I was, standing in a pitch black house, feeling uneasy, standing frozen in place, because nothing was making sense. I walked around the house, and all I could hear was the damned grandfather clock ticking across his house. Old hand-me-down from his family. Pure silence as I searched that house, other than that tick 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 that almost felt like it was telling me time was running out, for me or everyone else in that house. I went upstairs, had rather thick carpet from the stairs and all upstairs. Can't tell if it was the house or carpet, but upstairs, always quiet, couldn't even hear that clock. I remember one detail now that still shakes me to the core. All the doors in the interior were open, and in most rooms you could see a few drops of blood on the floor. Not a lot, just a few drops. I don't recall if James ever told me how many people were supposed to show up, but I searched like 7 rooms before I saw that thing, and I probably missed blood in the main rooms where I entered. It was a small party, or maybe a larger party, I don't know. I remember how I heard my heart when I went upstairs. It was so quiet. The slow checking of each room, getting deeper and deeper. Then I got to what I think was the master bedroom, with its large window open, and the room was mildly illuminated by the moon. When I entered the room, that's when I finally heard it. A scraping sound, like a knife against bone. A wet, sloshing sound. Then a slurp. It was finally when I heard these noises, I realized I was too deep in. Instinct took over when I saw the silhouette of something knotty and thin, hunched over in the corner. I knew that's where the sound came from, and I pointed my phone light at it. It had a few bodies under it, and a good section of the carpet was stained with blood. It ignored me for the moment, locked in, eating its meal. It looked like someone's skin was expertly peeled off, then made into a suit, not for a human, for a human-ish thing. The skin was either too tight in some places or too loose in other places. But the skin didn't cover everything. Some places its real form shone through. It didn't have feet, but legs that ended in points, and its hands tore through the handbits of the suit. Its head was too small for its suit, and it just flopped around as it ate. It didn't eat like an animal. It used its fingers to cut chunks off, and just seemed to swallow the chunks very, very loudly. I remember how I screamed and bolted out of the room. and I heard it behind me, tap, tap, tap. I couldn't tell if that was the face bit of it flapping or its legs digging into the wood under the carpet. When I went down the stairs, the carpet on them made me lose traction and slide down the steps. I broke my ankle, but I kept running. I threw the front door open and got in my car as fast as I could. I remember how when I turned on the car, it was there in the driveway standing before my headlights. Then it dashed around the house into the woods. Never saw it again, but if I did, I wouldn't be able to tell you about. And now you know what terror is.
The Thing in the Forest.
Submitted by Adorable Distance 15. Hello everyone, this is not my story. This is a story told by the stepfather of a good friend of mine. These are his words. My story is about a scary experience I had about 15 years ago while exploring Canada that made me feel like I was crazy. When I was 30 years old, I went on a trip alone to explore the Boreal Forest in Canada and Alaska. I went alone to try and find myself again after going through some very stressful circumstances, but that's a different story and does have a connection to what happened during my trip. I had planned this trip for close to a year and spent a lot of money to ensure this trip was what I wanted. It cost close to $70,000 for just over 6 months, which was actually cheap for what I wanted to do. I planned this trip to be a solo, secluded adventure as much as I could to explore northern remote Alaska and the territories of Canada, which included a 4-week camping trip, which is where the scary story begins. I hired some of the indigenous people to help with my plan. They were very kind and offered me many options to satisfy my requests. One of the options they recommended really stood out. However, I did have to allow company for most of the first 3 months of my trip, but the camping trip would be 100% solo. It sounded amazing, so I agreed. I would start in Point Hope, Alaska, and make my way across to northern Ontario. The trip would start off by mostly dog sledding, snowmobiling, other snow vehicles, and flying where it wasn't feasible to travel by land. I would mostly hunt and fish for food, create fires, and cook what I caught. But I also brought plenty of survival food. This is why I agreed with the company. They were guides who knew the terrain and how to navigate through it safely. They shared some food they brought with them, like bannock and dried meats like deer, moose, and elk. We would camp out along the way or stay in yurts, sometimes even motels in small towns. They told me stories about tales from their culture passed down by many generations, and I ended up enjoying their company. The trip was amazing. I saw so much wildlife, and the scenery was amazing, especially the sky. I had never really seen northern lights like this before, and the crackling was something I didn't know they did. They were bright, and with how clear I saw the Milky Way, it gave me a sense of peace. I saw a pack of wolves take down a moose, owls, eagles, foxes, and even polar bears, which made my guides a bit nervous, though they did have a firearm for emergencies. We laughed, had a few drinks, cooked beef, hog, and fish, and had a blast. It was an amazing experience. They guided my journey until we got to Fort Severn, where we would rest for the day. From there, we would part ways and I would travel alone. This is where my trip turns into my most horrifying experience. The next morning, I gathered my things, bought a bit of food, and headed out. I planned to head deep into the Ontario Boreal Forest alone. I had previously pinned a location deep into the forest on my GPS to travel to. I wasn't 100% sure I could make it, but that was part of the challenge. I traveled on foot for 10 hours straight during the day and slept at night in a hammock. It wasn't easy by any means. The forest was dense and hard to tread through, but I was determined. Everything was fine for the first 2 days. I managed to cover about 20 kilometers, but on the third morning, I had an eerie feeling. That morning, some of my stuff was scattered around, but I just told myself that it was probably some animals trying to get at the food I hung in a tree. But the weird thing was, I didn't hear anything during the night. It was very quiet, no noises of animals or insects. It didn't occur to me that anything was wrong, so I gathered my things, ate, and then headed out again. It started to get dark, so I decided to find a good place to sleep for the night. Once I did, I set up camp. This time, everything that wasn't essential was hung in trees. I lit a fire, made some food, and just enjoyed the scenery as the sun set. Then, once it got really dark, I heard something. It sounded like a very familiar voice of someone calling for help in a little girl's voice. "Help me, I'm lost." That voice almost made me cry, and it was extremely unnerving. I looked around the best I could, but at that point it was pitch black, and my line of sight was probably about 10 feet. I nervously called out, "Sherry, are you okay? Can you see my fire?" Then again I heard, "Help me." The voice changed a little. It was deeper. Now the hairs on the back of my neck raised, and a sudden sense of danger overwhelmed me. I took out my flashlight and looked around more thoroughly, and then that's when I saw it. A figure, hunched over, within the trees, arms fully stretched out to the side, with its fingers spread out in an unnatural manner, eyes glowing. It had an oversized mouth open very wide and smiling. I just stood there trying to comprehend what the fuck I was seeing, until its head rotated upside down, and it collapsed to the ground, then started crawling really fast towards me. I heard bones snapping. I don't know what I was thinking, but I heard a whisper, "Run." So I bolted. I left everything I had there except the flashlight in my hand and a bit of emergency dried food I had in my pouch. I ran as fast as I could and didn't stop, but I heard it pursuing me and calling me, telling me to stop in what sounded like my wife. I kept hearing, "Please stop, I'm scared," but I ran away. I don't know how I managed to navigate through the forest, but I did end up falling down a small hill into a wet mud pit and just lay there. I heard my wife calling me, Sherry, asking me where I was, or saying she was scared, a cell phone ringing to my wife's tone, weird chattering noises, a voice saying, "I'm hungry, where are you?" growling, and lots of footsteps all over the place. But I was so petrified, I just lay there, paralyzed with a fear like I've never felt before. That mud pit ended being my saving grace, because after what seemed like an eternity, the voices stopped. I heard the sound of morning birds, and the sun began to rise. I waited until it was fully light out and crawled out of the pit. I gathered my head and checked what I had. A bit of water, a couple of bars of food, and thankfully my GPS. I managed to navigate to a country road. It took me another 5 days, staying in ditches at night along the road while this thing was trying to hunt me, taunting me with every trick it had up its sleeve. I think the mud made it lose track of me. During the day, I would navigate towards the closest town. Along the way, I managed to get to a highway, where I saw one lone semi-truck traveling towards the town. I flagged it down. The guy, an older gentleman driving, looked and asked if I was okay. All I said was, "I've been lost for over a week straight and running from some animals." He looked at me and said, "You were lucky." The man told me a story about his brother who went hunting in these forests. He said he wouldn't talk about what happened, except that the forest was haunted. Whatever his brother experienced scared him enough that he never went hunting ever again. I ended up telling him what happened. The guy's face went pale, and we were silent for the rest of the ride. He drove me to Kenora, where he let me stay at his place for the night. In the morning, his brother came by. He and the old man talked. The old man's name was Steve, and his brother is Jim. Jim looked back at me, eyes wide open. I nodded back at him. We both shared our stories. What I described was exactly what he saw. I ended up staying in Kenora, and we all became pretty good friends. But Steve died about 3 months after this. He was 63. His brother and I stayed friends for about 2 years until he died of liver failure because he was an alcoholic. I tried my best to get him to stop drinking, but the nightmares kept reliving that experience. I had them too, so I understood he needed an element of escape. I too became an alcoholic. The nightmares were just too much. He was only 35 when he passed. His friendship meant a lot to me. Afterwards, about another year, I moved to Winnipeg and tried to get my life back in order. I joined AA and got clean. This is where I met my current friends. I told my story at a meeting. I started with, I don't care if you think I'm crazy. So that's my story. I'm not the best writer, so my apologies if it isn't written all that great. Some backstory. Sherry was my daughter. She was 5, but got cancer and lost the battle. She died 4 months after her diagnosis. My wife couldn't take the pain and ended up hanging herself 6 months after Sherry died. It was her voice that told me to run. After their deaths, I was destroyed so much that I planned this trip not to find myself. What I really meant was that I planned this trip for me to also commit suicide. I was going to hang myself deep in the forest to rot, because that's how I felt inside. Rotten. I used my entire life savings to plan this trip because I had no intention to come back. Think back to this day many times. It made me reconsider taking my life, and I went to therapy. I'm still working towards coming to terms with my past, but things are much better now.
Me and my friends went camping, and it was the worst mistake of my life.
Submitted by blank 0910. How does one comprehend the impossible? The truly impossible. But I suppose this would be the improbable, as this happened to me. This all happened a few weeks ago. I was living a perfectly boring life, but after that day, I can't even leave my house. I see it racing around my mind, but the image is so clear, like it's standing there in front of me. I feel myself trapped in the moment, tortured by the memories that haunt me. I'm writing this as a warning, and in case nobody ever hears from me again, to act as a recant of what happened. Don't go into the woods. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon at the supermarket where I work. Stood behind the register scanning people's stuff, glazed look in my eye, just waiting for something to happen. Until my best friend, out of respect for their families, for the purpose of this story, I will be calling all my friends by their first initial. T calls me out of the blue and asks if I can take the next few days off from work to come camping with him and some friends. I have some vacation days saved up, so I'll check with my manager. It wasn't unusual for T to call me up randomly. He's the free-spirited rock climbing, hiking, surfboarding, freaking paragliding type that always has something they want to get you in, but as far as most of the things he's tried to get me into camping, pretty tame. Of course, there was going to be something else to it. T wasn't the type to do something so relaxing, but at the time, I didn't care. I just wanted a few days to hang out with my friends, drink some beers, have some barbecues, and just chill. If I only knew what I was in for. The place we arrived at was called Achopko Lake, apparently. Apparently T discovered it on his most recent hike in the mountains. It was a beautiful place. The water was crystal clear. You could see all the way to the bottom. The spruce trees that surrounded us were so thick that we were completely secluded. You could barely see 10 feet into the forest. Perfect place to relax for a few days. This was not a well-established trail. We were pretty off the beaten path, but still only around 3 miles from the road we came here on, and left the cars. I don't know how more people don't know about the place. We are completely alone. The other 3 friends that came with me and T are E, J, and T's girlfriend, L. I've known E and J since high school, but I've known T since I was a baby. We grew up across the road from each other and have been best friends since birth. But L and I had only met twice, once at a party T and L were throwing as a meet my new girl thing, and the other was today. That being said, you all got on well. The first day was mainly spent just setting up camp, getting a fire pit established, and getting the food hung up in a tree away from the camp. I was told by T and E that there were bears out there. I didn't know if they were messing with me, but I wasn't taking any chances. I'm just glad I brought my rifle with me, and I was hoping to catch a deer while we were out there. While we were setting up E and J's tent, they weren't a couple, but we only had 3 tents and nobody wanted to bunk with me because I have insomnia and keep them awake. Something felt weird, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what was wrong. It wasn't anything inherently wrong, it was just odd, and I wasn't the only one that noticed it. E had too. He didn't say anything, but I could see on his face he had noticed it too. After we got the tents up, we all sat around the fire drinking a couple of beers. We had some sandwiches prepped by Elle before we left, so we didn't have to make food on the first night. She was nice, like that was, as I'd been repeatedly told by T. We exchanged funny stories, like the time Jay bet T he couldn't climb to the top of a lamppost and he fell, ended up falling onto Jay, and Jay remarked that the fire reminded him of E's ginger hair flowing in the wind. We all laughed. I still remember the sound of them laughing, but it was followed by the most horrific shriek ever. The sound was like no sound I have ever heard. It was like a child was being ripped limb from limb. Only the sound seemed to come from everywhere, all around us. In every direction, needless to say, we all hurried up to bed pretty quick after that. I sat in my tent all alone, rifle in hand, all night listening, looking for shadows. Nothing much happened though. As we woke the next morning, it was clear none of us had slept very much, if at all. The air was thick with fog and the fire had burned right down to the embers. We got the fire going again and sat around the fire. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak up about last night, so we all just sat there in silence until T decided to be the one to speak. What the hell was that last night? One by one they all jumped in. It must have been a mountain lion. They make a sound like that. What if someone was hurt last night? All good theories, but that's all they were. Elle tried to change the subject with breakfast. We all sort of agreed that we should. I think it was more to put our minds off it than actual hunger. We all headed out of camp to the tree where we hung the food, only to discover the remains of what used to be our food. The ground was littered with empty meat packets, burgers, steaks, ribs, all gone. But nothing else. T said it must have been a bear, and I said if it was a bear, they would have eaten everything, not just the meat. And even if they had, why hadn't any of the other scavengers come to eat what's left? That's when it hit me what was wrong with this place. What was making the hair stand up on the back of my neck the other day. It was the sound. There was no insect sound, no bird song, nothing, just the noise of the trees blowing in the wind. We beelined it back to camp as quickly as possible, the safety of our camp. What felt like an impenetrable fortress compared to being out in the forest. The day progressed onward. We were all frightened and ready to go home. We all collectively agreed to leave this afternoon, so we started tearing down camp. We were almost ready to go when we heard the sound of E screaming for help. But we all turned around to see where it was coming from, and Jay said he just went into the woods to take a leak before we left. We all ran into the woods, me armed with my rifle, T with a pistol he bought to fend off bears. It wasn't until we got deeper into the forest that we realized that the scream was almost monotone, like there was no emotion behind the screams of what seemed like excruciating pain. At this point the sun was starting to set, and through the fig tree canopy it looked like night. We kept walking through the forest, but we never seemed to get any closer. It had been going on for around 20 minutes at this point. No matter how much we walked, we never got any closer to the source of the sound. We all eventually came to a clearing in the forest. There was something familiar about the trees, the lake. It was our camp. Well, since we cleared everything, it was just a clearing now with a fire pit in the centers. How did the screams lead us back to where we started, and more importantly, why? I approached the fire pit, and its all burnt out coals. As I kneeled by it, there was something I caught in the corner of my eye. It was E's body dangling, but not hung from a tree. He was being held by his feet by that impossible thing. E's body was torn to shreds. He had large gashes down his front. The blood that oozed from the gashes was the deepest color of red I have ever seen. He turned his ginger hair, a dark shade of orange. He died screaming in pain, the expression etched into his face. The creature that stood, holding my friend's lifeless body in his hand, truly was an awful thing. It stood at around 8 feet tall. Its body was a pale, almost white but not quite. It had large claws on both its hands and feet. It had a thin, almost emaciated body but large, rotund gut. Its eyes were sunken and black. They were the darkest black I had ever seen, like seeing to the depths of your soul black, and a thin, crooked smile with blood dripping. It dropped his body and sprinted at inhuman speed right at me. Luckily, T had the good sense to fire at it before it got to me. He hit it in the leg, and it let out a blood-curdling scream in the voice of our recently departed friend. The blood that dripped wasn't red, but pure black. It turned to T and hit him so hard he flew into the trees and got impaled on a branch. The thud rang out amongst the silent trees. No scream, no nothing. Just a thud echoing. It seemed to go on forever, then a scream like a woman dying from the creature's still closed, smiling mouth. Elle screamed like a mother who had lost her child. The creature chose her next. It moved towards her with impossible speed, picked her up by her head, and looked at her in the eyes, still smiling, and ripped her in half, showering the grass, turning the beautiful fields of grass into seas of red. She was left crawling on the floor, dragging her torso, leaving behind a trail of blood as she tried to move away, screaming in pain. I was stunned. It had all happened so fast I didn't know what to do. Just lay there with a horrified look on my face. So shocked I could do nothing but look on in fear as it slaughtered my friends. The monster, for some reason, decided that it was time to run off. It climbed a tree that had T's body in it, and dragged his limp body off into the forest, just as the sun fell beneath the horizon, and it turned to night. It moved so quick I could barely track it with my eyes. As I watched it take my friend into the night, I turned to the only remaining member of the group, Jay. He was on the floor in the fetal position, crying. I picked him up and dusted him off. I looked right in his eyes, wrapped my hand around the back of his neck and pulled him as tight as I could. After what seemed like a long time, he pulled back and said, "What are we going to do?" I had no answer for him. This wasn't some movie where I stand up in defiance and say we were gonna kill that thing. I was so scared I could barely stand. My legs were shaking so badly. All I knew was I didn't want to die in this field. We decided the only way out of this was to make a run through the woods to the car. At least then we could get out of here and get help. It was only 3 miles, but 3 miles through the woods, in the direction that the monster ran off in. Slowly trudging our way through the forest on high alert, rifle aimed up in the trees, looking for the slightest slight of movement. As we moved gingerly, there was a sound of leaves rustling behind us. Then on the left, in front, right, it's encircling us. We just keep moving forward, eventually developing into a sprint. Why hasn't it attacked yet? At first, I thought it was because it was trying to split us up, but we've kept moving, and the same thing is happening. Right, behind, left, front, nothing. It wasn't until we were around half a mile away that the sound just stopped. Not the sound of it running, but everything, the sound of the wind in the trees, even the bird and insect noises that came back around a mile back. Nothing. Then everything came back all at once when it attacked. I managed to pull Jay forward far enough that it missed a killing blow, but it still took out his ankle and the foot was practically severed. He screamed in pain. He was bleeding out and fast. I grabbed him over my shoulder and carried him as far as I could. I don't know how, but it made it back out the clearing, just off the road where we left the cars. I pulled out my keys and placed Jay on the ground while I unlocked the car. I looked at his face and he was pale as a ghost, hardly able to move. I turned to unlock the car. It must have been 2 seconds at the most. I turned back, then it was standing at the tree line watching. I don't know why, but it never crossed the tree line. It just stood and watched, waiting for us to pass back over. Not shouting or screaming, just watching. It almost looked scared, looking around at the outside world until it ran back into the forest. I loaded Jay into the car. I pulled off as fast as I could and I pulled into the closest hospital I could find and unloaded him, yelling for help. He had bled out on the back seat as we drove through the night. I'm surprised he lasted as long as he did with that wound. I looked on in as they loaded him onto gurney to take him to the morgue. I sat a lump on the floor watching as they wheeled away my last remaining friend. Of course, the police were called to investigate, but that found no evidence that I had any involvement in the killing of my friends. Obviously, I tried to warn them about the monster, but they found no evidence of that either. Not that I think they believe me anyway. It got chalked up as some psycho out in the woods killing people. There was still a manhunt out looking for him, but they won't find anything, so this is my warning to anyone willing to listen. Don't go into the woods. So yeah guys, hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, leave a like, maybe even subscribe to show your support. And by the way, if you have an interesting story like this, make sure to leave it down in the comments, and if it's interesting enough, I'll even feature it in a future video. So have a good one. Peace.